the city of St. Louis, you're listening to the Don't Push Pause podcast with your hosts, Justin Johnson and Lindsay Reber.
Welcome to the podcast.
We're back again.
How are you, Lindsay?
Let's see, how am I? I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
I'm doing okay this week. What about you?
I'm doing okay. I'm always happy when we get to that day where we get to talk about movies.
I know. We spend a couple weeks, 2 weeks preparing for an episode generally.
Yeah.
And when it comes to this point, I'm ready. Game.
Yeah. Every time we do a movie for the podcast, I generally watch it 2, sometimes 3 times.
Yeah.
And sometimes we do some pretty heavy movies, so that second or third viewing can I'm like yeah. I don't want to watch this just quite yet again, but I believe of all the movies we've done, this is a movie I think I could just watch and watch and watch, and I never get sick of it, and that's Joe Dante's The Burbs.
The Burbs.
I'm thrilled that we're doing this film.
I know you have shown this movie quite a few times in your backyard, right?
Let's see, this last July would have been our fifth year of showing it annually.
Is it always on the same weekend?
It's always on right around 4th of July, just to kind of celebrate the holiday, and we always serve pretzels and sardines and brownies.
And for those of you that haven't seen The Burbs, or it's been a little while, yeah, pretzels and sardines. It's a big scene.
They make
in
a big
the movie.
scene. Yeah. I think it's great to do this one. It's a fun film. I think it's one that didn't, it's now it's considered a cult classic like a lot of movies that we've done. But it's one that I still think is not seen by quite a few people. It was definitely a movie that failed at the box office, and it didn't really get much of a chance upon its regular release 30 years ago. It is the 30th anniversary of The Burbs. Which is exciting. And
it looks, aside from some things, I mean, this movie still looks contemporary to me.
Yeah. And a lot of the ideals are pretty contemporary. A lot of the humor and satire, I think, is applicable today as it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, and that's saying a lot for the idea of what American culture or, suburban society really hasn't changed all that much.
Yeah. Just swapping out the technology. That's
that's really
only big difference.
No one has cell phones in this.
Yeah.
Oh man, this is another movie that probably couldn't exist. You just Google what your weird neighbors like their name and find out what their history was if they'd been arrested, where they lived before. Movie be over in 5 minutes.
Well, though this is a comedy, there's quite a bit to talk about. This is a huge cast, an excellent cast. Ensemble cast, which we always love talking about.
Yeah, this movie is kind of chock full of a lot of people. First, starring Tom Hanks, mainly Bruce Dern, Carrie Fisher. I love her role in this. Corey Feldman, on the late 80s part of his career. Rick Ducommun, and let's see, who else do we have here?
We've got the Joe Dante crew that he cast of characters they always uses. Henry Gibson, Wendy Schaal, Robert Picardo, and Dick Miller, who I love.
Yeah. I'm sure we're going to talk about the cast and how they all interact in this movie and make it work. The themes, overall general satire on suburbia, and a little bit deeper than that too, but without being heavy-handed or having some type of message.
Yeah,
really.
This is definitely a relatable movie, but like you said, not heavy-handed.
Yeah, no.
But definitely is, satirical and sharp. Definitely talk about Joe Dante's career. He's a filmmaker that we truly do love on this podcast. And he's one that, we've really wanted to get in here for one of his main films.
And even if you don't know him by name, you have seen his movies.
Yeah.
We'll go into that.
We'll get into his career.
And as far as The Burbs go, I'm sure we'll be talking about how this is a hyper-stylized movie, how there's a specific look to it, and also how it's a little bit of a throwback to movies of the 50s of when Joe Dante was growing up.
Speaking of how stylized this movie is, it's been a while since he's been on the podcast, but Justin Hayward is back, and he will be breaking down the scene for us and kind of going into how stylized one of the scenes in the Burbs are. I don't want to give anything else away because I always love he's going to say it better than I ever could anyway.
It's always a surprise.
So we'll have Justin Hayward here talking about a scene from the Burbs as well.
We love it when he's on the podcast.
And then also we'll do our picks of the week. I went Joe Dante as well for my pick of the week with his 1993 film Matinee with one of our hometown heroes, John Goodman.
I could have gone for just about any Joe Dante movie, but I went the Tom Hanks route, and specifically since Tom Hanks and Carrie Fisher were in a movie called The Man with One Red Shoe, I decided to go with that one.
I'm excited to hear you talk about this. This is one I don't know that I've seen since I was a kid. So
you and a lot of people.
Yeah, kind of forgot about that one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those are our picks of the week, so you'll hear about those. We'll round everything out with our Murray moments. But before we get into our first fun clip from the Burbs, Lindsay, can you break it down for us? What's going on in this movie? What's the Burbs about?
Sometimes the idea of suburbia for some folks seems very appealing and pretty tranquil in some ways. And for others, it is mind-numbing. So for the Burbs, we find a specific group of neighbors who, all seem pretty happy in their lives. Maybe it's a little mundane, but they're bored enough to start thinking that their weird neighbors that just moved in might just be part of a satanic cult. I mean, we've all been there. I've definitely thought I've had some weirdo neighbors.
Yeah, I think we've all can relate to having peculiar neighbors.
Now, satanic cult, maybe not. I've gone there. Definitely like a serial killer. I've lived next to a few serial killers in my life.
Yeah, and but this definitely is we'll get into it, but I love how it can show how your mind can play tricks on you. How this movie,
man.
Things can escalate pretty quick in your mind.
It plays on so many things that I think get the relatable laugh out of us.
Well, we'll go into a clip from the Burbs, and then we'll come back. We'll start talking about it.
I can see the news report now. They were a quiet family, kept pretty much to themselves. No one would have ever suspected them of foul play.
I've never seen that. I've never seen anybody drive their garbage down to the street and then bang the hell out of it with a stick. I've never seen that.
I say we go over and get a look in those garbage cans.
Well, call me overly cautious, but don't you think that's going to be a bit suspicious? The three of us going through the garbage at 11 o'clock at night in the middle of a rainstorm?
Affirmative. That garbage is going nowhere. I say we wait till first light. Scope me. I'm out of here.
Rained away.
Bummer. Ray, what was that you were saying the other day about half-cocked theories, I think? Ray, sleep tight.
So there's so many great lines in this. It's just endlessly quotable, and much respect, much kudos to Dana Olson for writing the script. And Dana Olson, during the making of the Burbs, he was actually on set for the whole movie. There was a writer's strike going on, so he couldn't actually do any rewrites.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, it's thankful for a movie to have such a witty cast of comedic characters who, comedic actors who can, improvise and fill in the blanks if need be. But I think this is a very solid script by Dana Olson. It has all of the wit and humor, and I think granted, you have to get comedic actors that can sell these lines because, it's a somewhat silly premise and very silly lines, and you get the wrong person saying these lines, they're not going to come
fall
off
flat.
We'll get into the themes and stuff, but I think this is an excellent script, and I think it's somebody who's very observant of human behavior and finding the sort of silliness and humor in everyday life.
And with Dana Olson being on set, Joe Dante cast him as one of the cops.
Yeah.
And he said that, he can't do any rewrites per se, but he can, maybe whisper some things if he has some ideas.
Yeah.
Something like that. And as the story does take place in kind of anywhere USA, the idea was to set this in an actual on-location place, like Ohio, I think, was one place that was talked about. But I think it's going for a Midwest feel. But it was Joe Dante that really thought that in order to extract out kind of the ridiculousness of the plot, while also making it kind of having that movie magic behind it, he thought that all of it needed to happen on set on a soundstage.
Yeah, and this is actually this is shot on the Universal lot, and movies that Joe Dante grew up on watching, where all the movies were set in on sets, on backlots. In the 70s and 80s, a lot of movies were shot on location for a more naturalistic look. But I think it really works for this movie, and I think right away when you see it, you're like, this is off. It looks kind of fake. The neighborhood looks almost like too perfect, and I think it really works for the film. I also just a little behind the scenes trivia. A lot of the actors really loved the fact that they shot this on the backlot because, it was in LA, all the actors live in LA, and they said it was like one of the few times where their job was kind of a 9-to-5 thing where they got up, they drove to the set, they shot for like 8 hours, and they got to come home and stay at their house at night. They weren't like in a different part of the country and like in the jungle or in some, and live in water in some kind of like crazy situation. So they said it was a very controlled, very fun and lively set.
And another thing with that too is that they were at one point, they were the only film that was being made at that point. I think the other one was the sequel to Fletch. And so it was just kind of not busy other than the Universal tour that would occasionally pass by and interrupt. I mean, I don't think it would actually interrupt filming because they couldn't afford to stop filming. They just kept going.
Well, there's definitely some scenes that you can tell are clearly ADR'd in this. And I know Joe Dante was saying in a discussion that they did ADR a lot of stuff because when the tour was going on, you'd hear people going, ooh and ah, and like you'd hear the tour guide over the microphone saying they're shooting a movie right over here. So they would have to, cut that out of the final sound mix.
And Justin, for our listeners, what does ADR mean?
Additional dialogue recording. So that means that if there's a plane flies over, something's bad, the actors will come in and they'll basically redo their lines over the image of the pre-recorded image of them and try to mimic best that they can. But it works a lot of times perfectly on a wider shot where you can't really see the actors' mouths, but a lot of times if it's a medium or close-up shot, and you've probably noticed this before when you've watched movies in the past where their lips are moving and they don't quite match up and the audio is a little bit too clean. You get this like really clean, like close mic'd audio. But usually it works if it's a fast moving scene, you don't really notice it, but there are a couple close-up scenes where you can kind of tell that they did that. But you got to do what you got to do to make it work. Yeah,
and in another interview with Joe Dante, he said that it was because of this instance when he realized, oh, this is why so many movies that I loved growing up, the audio sounded so hollow and weird, and it was because it was cheaper to, dub the audio in rather than reshoot what they were already being shot.
Well, let's get into a little bit about just the themes of the Burbs and what's happening in this very sort of crazy story and very, very satirical world of this clean-cut suburban neighborhood. I think this movie does the excellent job of being a satire, being very sharp, being very witty, kind of skewering this life of suburban life of people go to the suburbs and they have kids and they don't come to the city anymore and they become these weird versions of themselves. I think that this movie does a really great job of satirizing that without being extremely cynical, which I think sometimes is a really hard thing to do. And I feel like a lot of times movies can do that, satires can do that, where they're skewering a part of life and it almost seems too mean-spirited, to where it can be funny at times, but the cynicism comes through too heavy. And I think it kind of ruins some of the comedy. You almost feel like, it's making fun of somebody, not so much like making fun of the situations. And this movie, I think, does a hyper stylized version. It does this like exaggerated version of suburban life without, being mean spirited.
Yes, I'm over here nodding, and I couldn't agree with you more that there is nothing mean spirited in this movie. And if anything, it is not necessarily poking fun at or saying that there's anything wrong with suburban life, just the things that come along with that. For some folks, they know exactly like what's happening. It's all planned out and it's all easy. And I think this movie is playing upon the idea of being bored more so than it is being mean about a certain way of life.
I think this is a play on how controlled a life can be when you live in an area where not a whole lot happens, where not a whole lot is going to interrupt your day of something without you knowing it. In the city, it's like we both live in the city of St. Louis here, and just sometimes just going to the grocery store can be, before I even get into the door, I can talk to like 5 people who are like asking me questions. Like, it can be a very highly intense situation. So, and I think in the way that living in the suburbs, not a lot can happen. So there could be this like level of excitement when something out of the ordinary does happen. In the city, about 10 out of the ordinary things happen to me on a daily basis. So like, I don't even like blink at it anymore.
Yeah.
I'm just assuming that some weird crap is going to happen to me when I need to go down to get a couple beers from the gas station. And you could do a whole movie on city life, a hyper stylized version of how weird things are. And there are movies like that, like After Hours, or movies where they are sort of doing lampooning city life. And I think this movie does a great job of showing, this sort of like controlled lifestyle of like nothing really happens. And then when something out of the ordinary does happen, something is peculiar that invades their neighborhood, which they've all tried so hard to live this quote unquote normal lifestyle, nobody can deal with it. And then they become obsessed with it. And eventually they become kind of the weirdos. Like if you're on the outside looking in, they're the ones that are digging through trash cans and doing all these like weird things because they've become obsessed with their neighbors and finding out if they are these sort of sinister characters that they've built up in their heads.
I think The Burbs is a good kind of like push and pull thing between being somewhat like playing off of the idea of being, xenophobic versus also the dangers that can come along with feeling insulated and feeling protected. And then like you need to immediately defend yourself against anything that's out of the ordinary. And when you're used to something and used to nothing getting in the way and everything always just kind of working out right, when you have something that throws a wrench into that or that is out of the ordinary, obsession develops really quickly, or at least trying to solve the mystery or creating a mystery, even if there's nothing there, which The Burbs does a great job up until the very end of, you're not really sure if these guys are just bored and making up that their neighbors are Satanists, or if it's them that are really the weirdos.
And another thing I love with this and with the script is that while it's giving you these sort of clues as to whether the neighbors may or may not be these like heinous characters that are killing people and burying them in their backyard, we're given little things along the way. But what I really like about the script and the way it plays out is that it doesn't get repetitious. There's speculation on what's going on with their neighbors. Then they, try to go over in the night and investigate things, and they see something kind of wacky. Eventually the whole neighborhood gets involved. But what the script does, and I think what's really smart to do in a movie like this, especially in the comedy, is you keep pushing the story forward by escalating the situations, making them get bigger, and then eventually there's this sort of like explosion of like information and like characters like coming to their breaking point and all coming together and helping each other out, or like defeating the conflict of the story. In this case, them finding out what the neighbors that they are suspecting are really doing. The movie really is fast paced, and I don't think that it sort of like keeps repeating itself. It keeps giving you information, and it keeps putting the actors in really fun situations. It doesn't ever get old to me, them like, an event, and there's not a whole lot that happens. It's like basically them sneaking around their neighbors trying to find out what they're doing. But I think there's really like creative ways of making that happen and keeping the movie fun and keeping it going without, like I said, repeating itself and like getting boring.
You have to have that escalation in each one of these instances. Because if you don't, you have the same joke that's just beaten to death, like when you're watching a Saturday Night Live skit and you know that it's failing. And I mean, anything that has the same joke and repeating it, and then it ends and you're just kind of like, well, that was kind of a dud. This, it escalates to the point of a, like you said before, like kind of figurative explosion, but also in this, a very quite literal explosion.
When you have a character, Tom Hanks being the main central character, he starts out as a cynic, and then eventually becomes the leader of the pack, like he leads them into finding out, and then ultimately finds the truth, and then ultimately resolves the situation. And so you have a character who comes full circle. And I think that that's a really wise thing to do, again, especially in a comedy, because a comedy so many times can be live and die by the jokes.
This movie can be looked at a few different ways, whether it is judging your neighbors just based on speculation or what they look like, or the idea of just being kind of ignorant in some ways, or burying your head in the sand like Tom Hanks's character tries to do a few times, or just pretending like it's not there, or even like the guys' wives, kind of putting it down and saying, you guys are overreacting. Just all of these different type of reactions. And I think another thing that is very obvious in this is watching these grown men start to act like teenagers or start to act like kids. And the one or two kid, mainly Corey Feldman, is kind of the audience, kind of the observer, the adult that's just watching it happen. And the wives of these guys that are kind of being reduced to acting like adolescents are more like mothering characters, which I think it's really obvious when you watch the movie, but it does create this whole other line of humor that weave throughout the very obvious plot.
Yeah, I think there's a great dynamic between the characters, and there's a lot of room for them to sort of like flex the comedy in their acting and in the situations. We'll come back. We'll go to another clip. We'll come back. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the cast and their interactions, and then we'll get into a little bit about the career of Joe Dante.
Do you know what this is? It's a bone. It's a femur. It's a femur bone. A femur just happens to be a human thigh bone, right?
Wait, how do you know that?
Biology 101. I mean, look at the size of this thing. You think this came off a chicken or something? Where the hell did Vince get this?
He dug it up from underneath the fence.
Ray, there's no doubt anymore. This is real. Your neighbors are murdering people. They're chopping them up. They're burying them in their backyard. Ray, this is Walter.
So like we were saying before, having a cast like this in a comedy is kind of a godsend. I mean, having actors that can play off each other, especially in ensemble comedy, and especially in a lot of scenes where you have, 4 or 5 actors on screen at once, and they have to interact with each other. A lot of times, especially if you have 2 or 3 comedic actors, sometimes it can almost be too much. Everybody's trying to do their thing, but people play off each other so well in this, and so many scenes where you have 3 or 4 actors on screen. I think that there's just like this great give and take, and it just keeps the comedy flowing.
Some of my favorite scenes are between Tom Hanks and Carrie Fisher, and I feel like a lot of those involved quite a bit of ad-libbing. And another thing with the comedy in all of this is it never seems as if there's anyone trying to outdo the next person. It all seems very equal and such a good ensemble piece, and they're thinking about who they're sharing the scene with.
Yeah, Carrie Fisher is my favorite character in this movie.
Yeah. And
I think what Carrie Fisher does that's so fantastic is, I think in most movies that kind of set this kind of thing up, her character would have become the quote unquote like annoying wife, the nagging annoying wife. And I feel like she has spun that character and made her the voice of reason in this movie, and like questioning what her husband is doing and questioning what his friends are doing and trying to de-escalate all these situations.
Yes.
But she adds, I think, some of the best humor, some of the best looks, and some of the best lines come off from Carrie Fisher. I think she's like absolutely brilliant in this movie.
Yeah, after a couple viewings, I went back and forth on who I liked more in this movie, but I have settled on Carrie Fisher as well too, and it is just for that reason, because her character could easily be a throwaway character or just someone that doesn't really matter too much other than to be the antithesis to what Tom Hanks's problem is. But she adds so much depth, and I that is Carrie Fisher. That's what she can do.
And I think because she builds this character that's not a pushover, I think it makes it even more. It makes the scene even more intense when after the wives and the husbands have gone over to the house and met the Klopek family, the ones that they're suspecting of murderous crimes. When they get back, Tom Hanks is like, no, the women are right. We need to chill out. And because Carrie Fisher's because his wife has not been a pushover character, it makes it all the more funny when he's like convinced them that he's into them, and then he meets his friends in the back room and is like, no, I know what's going on over there. We need to wait till they go out of town and act fast and go over to their house. And I think but because they've built up this great relationship between Tom Hanks and Carrie Fisher, you feel sympathetic to Tom Hanks' character because he's kind of like going out of his mind, and she's comforting him, but she's also like wanting him to not hang out with his friends anymore and keep going on with these shenanigans. And so it just makes it even all the more funny to me because they've built up this relationship. It makes it all the more funny to me that he's like going against her with his friends to like break into their house at the end.
And it is funny, really, too, that she's perfectly acceptable as his wife. They seem like a couple, but also as this weird mothering figure, too, when it gets way more involved in Tom Hanks's obsession and palling around with his friends that are, coming up with these conspiracy theories. And
I don't want to spend too much time on this, but like with Tom Hanks, so much has been said about Tom Hanks. It's like, what more can you say? He's considered an American icon, a classic actor. He's won multiple Academy Awards. This is my favorite Tom Hanks movie. This is one of my favorite Tom Hanks performances. I watch this and I can remember how witty and funny Tom Hanks can actually be. Unfortunately, we don't see that too often in his movies anymore. He does bring it when he does interviews. I saw a recent interview with him on Jimmy Kimmel back when he was promoting Toy Story 4, and you just you're just reminded of how much wit and how much comedic timing he actually has. And and I get it, he grew out of that, he did more serious movies, but this movie actually came at a time in his career where he was in the slump. He did Bonfire of the Vanities, he did Joe versus Volcano, and all these movies were bombs. And I can see why he kind of was like leaning toward, well, maybe I should try something different and do something more dramatic. And to me, I do consider this to be one of the last films in the Tom Hanks canon of comedy. I mean, he did give some humorous moments in movies like that we did before, like A League of Their Own. But to me, this is like one of the last of the full-on Tom Hanks comedic role where he's like got the whole physical comedy thing going on. He has the whole hyper intense version that he does, the spaz of himself. And I think that this is like one, to me, he like honed it in so well. And to me, this I think is like 100% pure, like adrenaline, funny Tom Hanks.
It really was A League of Their Own, I think, where that transition between being dramatic and comedic were evenly matched. And it's not to say that in some of these comedies that there weren't dramatic moments, because there were a ton of them. But it's also funny to me that a newer generation looks at Tom Hanks as this Oscar winner, and like movies like Forrest Gump and Apollo 13 and all of these movies that he's gotten a lot of Oscar recognition for and is regarded as The Green Mile, like all of these movies that he is touted for being a great dramatic actor. And I think it's easy to forget that he started off in these comedies that are gold, and they're because he has such great comedic timing.
And I want to move on to Joe Dante, but much props to the other comedic actors in here.
Oh yeah, Bruce Dern, who has always been known for his more dramatic roles earlier before the Burbs and certainly afterwards, but for as ridiculous as his character is, he's pretty darn funny. And Rick Ducommun, who plays the best friend Art, he was a stand-up comic, R.I.P. He's also passed away. And he's also in so many bit roles in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, this is really one of his few like kind of big co-starring roles.
Yeah, he did such a fabulous job in this movie too.
I think he plays off Tom Hanks so well. I think he's like the yin to Tom Hanks' yang. I mean, they're sort of in this together, and I don't think that the movie I don't think it would have sucked you in as much without his contributions to like, kind of pushing Tom Hanks's character into this journey of like finding out what the next door neighbors are doing.
And as much as Corey Feldman had a career before this and after this, he represents the audience, and he's kind of just there, but he's doing what Corey Feldman can do so well. Yeah,
and to me, I hate to say it, but I feel like this was like the last Corey Feldman sort of performance where he's like the lovable goof, and and I feel bad, he like many young actors kind of drifted into sort of like a sea of like movies that weren't quite up to par with like what he had done in the past, but I think he does gives a really genuinely fun and funny performance in this.
Yeah, and props to Corey Feldman, man. That guy is still going.
Well, before we hear from our good friend Justin Hayward, I want to talk a little bit about Joe Dante and briefly talk about his career. I love Joe Dante so much. I think this is Joe Dante at the peak of his powers of directing and honing in his craft. Joe Dante had a great career. He started off, if you're familiar with Joe Dante's podcast, The Movies That Made Me, I don't know that there's anybody who knows more about the history of film and movies. I don't think that there's a bigger movie buff than Joe Dante. When you listen to him talk, it just blows my mind every time. Like his knowledge of like past movies and current movies. He just seems like he's just a sponge for film knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think he certainly brings that knowledge to all the movies he directs. And it's kind of a bummer that he's never really had a lot of hits. I mean, he had one hit with Gremlins, but for the rest of his career, he has all his movies, I think, are looked upon as cult classics now.
Yeah, there's so many that are great.
I mean, all these movies, I mean, the Burbs included, are considered classics now, but none of these movies were really appreciated when they came out. And I think that that's a reflection of someone who was kind of pushing the envelope. He was always blending genres. He was always kind of taking an old school approach to movies, chose really interesting movies, and really didn't, settle on doing like generic, safe sort of Oscar winning films. Certainly, I'm sure he wishes that he was that filmmaker, but I don't know that you can be upset with a career like that Joe Dante has had. No. Everything from starting out with working with Roger Corman, doing movies like Piranha, to doing the most insane sequel ever made, in my opinion, with Gremlins 2. I mean, just utterly off the wall.
And also kind of modernizing the werewolf genre in 81 with The Howling. That movie changed everything, and I think that same year or the year after, there were multiple werewolf movies to come out too, and it kind of changed things for that. And also with the Twilight Zone movie, which, think what you will of it, his part in that is easily the best segment of the Twilight Zone movie.
In mixing humor and romance, science, and just off-the-wall humor with a movie like Inner Space.
Love Inner Space.
Just a great family film with explorers. And recently, I'd say fairly recently, in the last 10 or 12 years, he made a movie that I really, really enjoyed. It's called The Hole. I think it would have benefited from having better actors, but it's actually it does have Bruce Dern in it, though, and it is, I think, pretty creepy, and it has an old school vibe to it. And it's one of the few, I think, horror films that can be, watched by a younger audience, but is also, I think, has some creepy tones. And it's a movie that I highly recommend people to go check out.
He also did a few episodes of Erie, Indiana, which a lot of people say it was a very short-lived show, but a lot of people say it was kind of the kid version of the X-Files, and I always talk about that show, but it was kind of changing things or just further advancing things. And Joe Dante has always had a great imagination, and in some ways I feel like he's always been ahead of the curve before it was cool.
He's a filmmaker who's very confident, very strong in his sensibilities and his style, and it's clearly been appreciated now with all his movies, like I said, being considered like these classics, but at the time, of course, was not recognized. And I'm glad that, I wish that he was, someone would give Joe Dante the money to direct a big budget movie again, but I'm glad that he has so many of these movies that we can revisit and appreciate for, the rest of our lives.
The thing about him, and just to kind of end this here, like you were saying, he makes these kind of magical and fantastical movies, but not in a superhero or completely out there sort of way, because he makes these magical movies that still feel relatable. And I think what that boils down to is because he is a movie lover, and he was that kid that went to the movies and spent would spend hours at the movies. And that's what he grew up on, and that's what he has or wants to transfer to others in his movie making. I think it is a genuine love of communicating a story, and not that he would not want to do something that is reality based, but I think that his version of reality are these magical interpretations.
You listen to any current discussions with him, and he just has the level in his voice. You can hear it. He has this level of excitement of a kid, when he's talking about films. It's really something wonderful. We'll end it here. We'll come back and do a little wrap up stuff, but I want to have time to hear from our good buddy Justin Hayward from Chicago. He is a huge fan of Joe Dante as well, and I'm really excited to hear him give us a little insight on Joe Dante and break down a scene from Burbs. So here he is. This is Justin Hayward.
I recently read an article by the esteemed cinematographer David Mullen where he talks about what looks, quote, real in cinema. Disclaimer, even though I personally agree, these opinions do not necessarily reflect the opinions of this podcast. Anyway, in the article, Mr. Mullen says, quote, realism in modern cinematography is sometimes merely the artificial copying of artifacts from documentary work in which there are uncontrollable elements or moments causing certain artifacts, focus problems, lens flare, underexposed and thus grainy or noisy images. It feels like reality because it looks rough, unplanned, unmanipulated, though the images may be as thoroughly designed and executed as the slickest shot ever made in a classic Hollywood movie. In other words, realism becomes just another form of artificial style, only this one conjures up associations with documentaries and thus gives the movie a false sense of honesty in its recreations. Then he goes on to say, this approach, used appropriately, can enhance the drama of a scene or an entire movie, but it sometimes can be used as a crutch by some filmmakers to avoid actually doing the hard work of making the movie. i.e. taking the time to think about the appropriate use of light and shadow to tell this particular story, and then executing that creative idea. This desire, by some, to avoid thinking about controlling or creating light even extends to other issues like composition. They fall into the trap of seeing the camera merely as a passive recording tool that follows whatever action occurs in front of it. He basically goes on to talk about how a lot of modern filmmakers claim to have substituted genuine classical filmmaking craft in favor of laziness, but do their best to hide their being lazy under the umbrella of realism. Again, not all filmmakers use this style because they're being lazy, but a handful of them do. And I happen to totally agree with Mr. Mullen on this point. They either don't want to or don't know how to do the hard work Mr. Mullen is referring to. Think about the scene in The Burbs when Hans, one of the Klopek neighbors, comes out of the house for what seems like the first time, and all the people on the block are outside watching in utter suspense. The whole cast lifts this moment with each of their brilliant and unique performances, but I'm going to stick to some of the technical stuff. There's a dolly into every one of their looks of shock as the music builds and builds. There's that shot behind Hans that dollies around him in a circle as he scratches his neck and reveals all the neighbors stone cold staring at him. The score just gets louder and more intense until Hans finally goes back inside. This leads Ray and Art to start daring each other to go knock on the door. When they finally both agree to do it, here comes that big score, and this time it's even more intense as the camera cuts between a tracking shot with Ray and Art up the sidewalk with slow zoom-ins on everybody's eyes, including the dog's, which is hilarious. The scene is simultaneously intense and funny, which isn't something you often see, and pretty much sums up the tone of the entire film. But that wasn't on accident. Notice the way the shots cut together like pieces of a puzzle. Each one fits snug in its place until it makes up the whole scene. But the scene doesn't work with just the meticulously planned shots and those great performances. There's a giant piece of the puzzle that simply doesn't exist until long, long after shooting, but something the director Joe Dante had to imagine in his head while planning those great shots. There's a YouTube video where somebody took the end award sequence in the first Star Wars movie and removed the music. It's really funny because without the large John Williams score accompanying those images, the whole scene feels awkward and strange. It would be the same way here. No music on that scene in The Burbs, and all the dramatic shooting would feel out of place. You can't zoom into a dog's eyes and not have a big booming score behind it. But the music isn't added until months after shooting and editing are finished. So if you watch it with the sound off, it's quite clear Joe Dante was not planning on this scene being quiet. He certainly chose those specific shots in a way knowing the score was going to be 50% of the scene, even if it was only in his imagination when shooting. Point is, the puzzle pieces of shots held together by the intense score and accented by those great actors isn't something that just falls into place completely unplanned. It takes time to plan and work out all this long before you get to set. That's what I think David Mullen meant when he said filmmakers doing the hard work. I find Joe Dante to be the epitome of a classical filmmaker that does the hard work. Every shot in The Burbs feels meticulously calculated, thought out, and executed for maximum effect, which is a really funny, mostly family-friendly horror comedy. You know, that old trope. Look, if all this sounds obvious, it's because it is. But there are a lot of people out there that don't know what they don't know. I've seen filmmakers call Quentin Tarantino a hack, which is fine if that's your opinion, but then don't you dare show me your independent film that looks like it was written and directed by a 12-year-old that's never seen a movie in their life. After that, your opinions will forever fall on deaf ears. There's a famous George R.R. Martin quote where he said art is not a democracy, meaning it's not fair. Unfortunately, not everybody is born with equal talent. You want to be a professional singer, but you can't hear pitch? Sorry, no amount of studying is going to change that. But how many people made fools of themselves in front of millions on those singing competition shows throughout the years, honestly believing they could be as good as Kelly Clarkson if only given the chance? At 41, I could never make a movie as good as Hard 8 with a $100 million budget, let alone been able to make it at 25 with a $3 million budget like Paul Thomas Anderson did. I am not now and will never be on that level. But I think that's a good lesson for every artist to learn early on, because while I mostly agree with George Martin, I also think you can be the best at what you're capable of being as long as you're not so self-delusional that you don't even know what that is. The late great director Sidney Lumet said every filmmaker needs to be a little self-delusional or they would never make anything. I agree with that, but if that self-delusion goes too far, you might wind up that guy that abandons the hard work of making a movie for, quote, realism.
Well, thanks so much for that, Justin. We always appreciate it when you come on the show.
It's so awesome. I love having another person on here to give us some insight and enjoy this movie with us.
Well, let's get into our picks of the week. My pick was Joe Dante's 1993 movie Matinee. Lindsay, you went with Tom Hanks' The Man with One Red Shoe.
Yes.
What can you tell me about that movie?
Well, Justin, as I was thinking about this pick of the week for the Burbs, there are so many choices that come to mind. So many great movies that either star the actors in the Burbs or any Joe Dante movie, really. But I chose The Man with One Red Shoe, starring Tom Hanks, because it is easily the lesser known and also co-stars the always wonderful Carrie Fisher, and is kind of the epitome of a great Sunday afternoon movie. It's an entertaining, even if somewhat ridiculous movie. All right, so The Man with One Red Shoe is a light spy thriller with a touch of romantic comedy. It's kind of like a spy versus spy type of plotline. One CIA higher-up trying to outwit and oust the CIA director out of a job by creating this scandal so he can become the director. Really, though, this plot doesn't matter too much in this movie. You get what's going on. Tom Hanks' character gets involved when the at-risk of being disgraced CIA director has him picked at random as a decoy to fool his adversary, saying that Hanks is a special agent that can absolve him of any scandal. It's not an involved plot, although it tries to kind of act as such. The comedy is built upon basically misunderstandings and misinterpretations, and Hanks is oblivious that he's being tailed, investigated, and messed with by government operatives trying to figure out how he's connected to the CIA director's cocaine smuggling scandal. It's really funny to explain this out loud because it's so ridiculous and paranoid. If you're entertained by spy-type movies, this one has all of the tropes, like a dart gun loaded with a knockout drug, tiny cameras used for secret photos, underground government installations and bugs planted everywhere, wiretaps, white vans. I mean, it's all right there. Although The Man with One Red Shoe is no knee slapper of a comedy, the story itself is like kind of jumbled, but it's the casting that makes this movie work. It's funny how that happens, though. With a lesser talented cast, I'm sure this movie would have been a complete stinker. It's not like it did well at the box office, but everyone in this cast is very talented and was able to propel it forward. On top of being nearest the beginning of Hanks's career, looking back now, we can see how his comedic timing has stayed solid for 40 years. God, that's so crazy, 40 years. Carrie Fisher and Jim Belushi play a married couple who are best friends and co-musicians in a symphony with Hanks, who Fisher is also having an affair with. Dabney Coleman serves up some straight-laced buffoonery, as he does so well, as the CIA deputy thinking Tom Hanks is some kind of genius spy outwitting him the whole movie. Laurie Singer, Charles Durning, Squiggy from Laverne and Shirley, and a ton of other recognizable faces from the 80s and before round out this savable by casting light thriller comedy. I think I enjoyed this movie as a kid because Tom Hanks is so animated and we see him constantly messed with by secret agent spies, so it's a easy way to land some type of sight gag jokes that are kind of all throughout the movie. Two scenes that stick out to me, one involving Laurie Singer's hair getting caught in Hanks's zipper while he awkwardly tries to walk. That's always a guarantee for a laugh. But I think my favorite is a somewhat lengthy scene wherein there's no dialogue, only Hanks, Fisher, and Belushi's symphony performing a dramatic classical number while exchanging these knowing glances, and while all the CIA operatives and spies are watching in the audience, scrutinizing every move, also giving dramatic, curious, or nothing here to see type looks at one another all over this intense classical performance. The scene really helps ramp up any tension without using any words. It's really brilliant, easy comedy. The Man with One Red Shoe came out in '85, a year after Splash and Bachelor Party, which both put Hanks on the map big time, not to mention multiple previous TV appearances and shows and 2 seasons of Bosom Buddies. It is really cute to kind of see the beginning of Tom Hanks's career and compare that to how he's blossomed into who he is today. And this is coming from me, a person who, Justin, I know you know this, but I was not the biggest fan, really, of Tom Hanks. Only a few movies here and there. And I only really liked seeing his face in Money Pit, and that was pretty much it until a long-lost friend a while ago made me sit down and actually focus on Joe versus the volcano. And I was finally like, okay, I'm going to get over my unwarranted problem with Tom Hanks. And you know what? I think officially, as of 2019, I'm over my problem. I actually like the guy now. So while The Man with One Red Shoe may not have been a box office smash like basically every other Tom Hanks film, it still serves as a very passable Sunday afternoon movie where you get to see a baby Tom Hanks play the innocent funny man that everyone fell in love with in the 80s.
I'm glad you've come around to Tom Hanks. What year did The Man with One Red Shoe come out?
It was 85.
85, okay. So this is like 3 years before he really became like a big sensation.
It was right kind of like it was when he was getting some traction with some movies and people were recognizing his talent, but hadn't had a giant hit. I mean, Splash did really well, Bachelor Party did really well, but not worldwide.
I need to go back and revisit this one. It's been a long time.
I'm not surprised. I think it's one of those movies, like I said, it's not the greatest movie in the world, but still going back and revisiting it, and for this, I watched it 3 times actually, and there were numerous moments that were a good chuckle, and I think it helps too if you like Carrie Fisher and Jim Belushi.
I'm like one of the few people out there that like really loves Jim Belushi.
Really?
I was like a huge Jim Belushi fan in the 80s.
Oh, he's such a cutie in this too, and he's very paranoid. And there's this thing that happens in the 80s where people are cheating on their partners, and it's like a source of comedic value, and like people get over it eventually, or not even eventually, like pretty much immediately. This is one of those things too where the whole idea of cheating is just a source of comedy, which is, unrealistic and funny. But The Man with One Red Shoe, totally worth a revisit.
I'll totally check it out soon.
So, Justin, I would love to hear you talk about Matinee. I just watched this and, man, was so charmed.
Yeah, this is a really charming movie. And this is, I think, probably one of the last few like big budget movies that Joe Dante did. To me, Matinee is sort of like Tim Burton's Ed Wood. It's a period piece. It's about a filmmaker, about a love for a filmmaker, about a love for movies. Matinee is a period piece that takes place during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's loosely based on low-budget film producer, filmmaker William Castle, who was known for doing these really low-budget sort of B horror movies, but he would actually go theater to theater with them, and he had these gimmicks to where like he would put buzzers on the seats for certain parts of the movies where it would buzz the audience, or he'd have a floating skeleton float through the theater, and he would always hype them up as being a movie that you shouldn't see. They're too scary. You'll get a refund if you go running out of theater, and so it would pique people's interest, especially younger kids, thinking like, I have to go see it. If someone's telling, grown-ups telling me this is too scary for me to watch, I need to see it. So he had a lot of gimmicks and a lot of ways to make profits on his films. And he was, loved by many filmmakers and influenced on many filmmakers. John Waters, namely, paid tribute to William Castle when he released Polyester, filmed in Odorama, where you had a scratch and sniff card that was also available in the DVD, where during the movie you could scratch different parts of the card that you can actually smell the scene that was going on. Kind of gross, but
and awesome.
Yeah, totally awesome. And so Joe Dante, also a fan as well, sort of fashioned a movie about William Castle. In the movie, the character is called Lawrence Woolsey, portrayed by John Goodman. He comes to a small Florida town during the Cuban Missile Crisis when everybody was terrified that they were, going to be obliterated by a nuclear warhead. And so there was a lot of fear already, and John Goodman sort of lands in this small Florida town. He's sort of preying on the fears of people by presenting one of his gimmicky movies. The movie sort of centers on a young boy who him and his brother have recently moved to this town because their father is in the military. So not only do they have a fear of this Cuban Missile Crisis, but they're also fearing for their father and other people who are in the military overseas. And it really, I think, is a very innocent view of this time period and how people were very fearful. It was kind of a crazy time in American history. The movie plays tribute to that, as well as a love of cinema. These boys go to the cinema. This is where all the teenagers go and all the kids go to sort of like, it's their one moment of like release. It's their one moment of escapism to sort of get away from, all the madness that's going on in the world. And very much like, a thing that we do today, a similar thing, going into a movie to sort of escape your everyday troubles and the fears of what's going on in the world. And it is a very loving tribute to films and filmmakers. A majority of the film takes place in an actual movie theater. I think this is like a truly great family film. I think that it does play a little slow, and I think that maybe some younger viewers might get bored by it, but it really is captivating. It's really a lot of fun. There's some humorous moments, and I think there's something for everybody in this movie, and I do think it's one of Joe Dante's like most charming and innocent films, and really, again, shows why he's like one of, I think, the better filmmakers still working today.
I really enjoyed watching Matinee. I did feel like it was such a mature family film that if you were able to make your kids focus, that they would really enjoy it and find some type of nostalgia within them that they didn't even know was there. And also a good way for parents to kind of connect with kids on that imaginary level too of going to see a movie.
And it also has I don't want to fail to mention another thing that Joe Dante does, bringing in Dick Miller and Robert Picardo again in great little roles, and a really fantastic performance by Kathy Moriarty. She's playing
so
John Goodman's partner in crime and going town to town to present these movies, and she's also an actor in the films that he does. And I'll say too, they show a good portion of the films that the film within a film, the movies that the Lawrence Woolsey, John Goodman's character, is presenting, and they show a lot of the clips of these movies, one of them called Mance, and the film within the film is equally entertaining. And there's also a film within a film that is a very, very short, quick moment of Naomi Watts in one of her first roles, which I never knew that. And then when I was watching, I was like, man, that looks like Naomi Watts. And I looked it up and I was like, sure enough, it was her.
Yeah, it was funny. I forgot that you had told me that until that scene came up and was like, oh yeah, totally. That's Naomi Watts. Look at that. But yeah, Kathy Moriarty, her performance in this was so solid. It was really nice to see her in this role.
So those are our picks of the week: The Man with One Red Shoe and Matinee. We'll keep moving on. This is your Murray moment.
Chicks dig me because I rarely wear underwear, and when I do, it's usually something unusual.
I think I need a root canal. I'm sure I need a long, slow root canal.
You gonna come and shake my monkey tree again?
Oh, what does that old queen know? She didn't even show.
Hey, this is so scrumptious. Is this hand shucked?
The flowing robes, the grace, all striking.
That was fun.
What led me to this week's Murray moment were two things. One, thinking about how ridiculous and paranoid the dudes are in the Burbs. And two, how ad-libbing can sometimes work so well in a movie. Since, how we talked about in the Burbs, there was a writer's strike, so a lot of actors were allowed to ad-lib quite a bit. Now, when fitting Billy into this, I couldn't help but have the everlasting image of Carl Spackler come to mind, his character from Caddyshack. Now, Carl's story in the movie really has very little impact on the actual plot until the very end, and then it's huge. It ends with explosions after obsession and paranoia have consumed Carl, but instead of it being about satanic neighbors like in the Burbs, it's his intense personal vendetta against a single gopher wrecking the golf course in Caddyshack. Now, Justin, I know Caddyshack isn't your jam, but I grew up with it and absolutely adore it. And those involved with making Caddyshack have never really been shy about talking about how crazy it was behind the scenes of the movie, and I could talk forever on that subject alone, but for this segment, I'm just going to lean on a little bit of Billy's involvement in the movie as it would pertain to the Burbs. First off, Billy's character of Carl had no lines in the actual script. Billy ad-libbed everything, from his Dalai Lama speech. If you're familiar with this movie, you know what I'm talking about. His Dalai Lama speech, the Cinderella story monologue, all his maniacal dives into gopher hatred, his rather lengthy one scene with Chevy Chase, all his background lines, his PG-rated perving out on the older lady golfers, everything. He made it all up on the spot. Whether Caddyshack or the Burbs, ad-libbing isn't easy for everyone. Now, writer-director Harold Ramis gave Billy inspiration for the Cinderella story monologue, but Billy was such a pro at improv by 1979, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. Ramis and writer Brian Doyle Murray, Billy's older brother and Second City alum, of course, were both never worried about leaning on Billy for that. Ad-libbing was just a thing that they knew he could do. It's a gamble for some and liberating for those talented enough to be awesome at improv or be comfortable in a scene with someone, like with Tom Hanks and Carrie Fisher, who had done The Man with One Red Shoe by the time they had done The Burbs. All Billy was given in the script for the Cinderella story speech was, and I quote, "The sky is beginning to darken. Carl, the groundskeeper, is absently lopping off the heads of bedded tulips as he practices his golf swing with a grass whip." That's it. Nothing else. And right before they were set to shoot, Ramis gave Billy some inspiration, telling him that sometimes when he would go out running, he'd talk himself up like he was an announcer, as if to like amp up his game or keep him enthused to keep going. And that was all Billy needed. He'd also been around enough golf in his life, so riffing on that subject was no big deal. And it being at the top of his SNL game, he was primed and able to easily slip into anything that was asked of him. And Ramis knew from their days together at National Lampoon's and Second City that he could bank on some comedy gold. They only had 6 days with Billy to complete these scenes in Caddyshack, and with so little time and nothing written for him in the script, Ramis, Billy, and Brian would just put Carl in different scenarios, describe the action that needed to happen, and Billy would just make up the lines. They just figure out how each scene fit into the movie later. It's so crazy to think that they banked on that. That's really putting some trust in a friend to just go on that. And get this too, the gopher aspect of Caddyshack was nowhere near as big of a deal as it was in the original script. As it turned out, the rough cut of Caddyshack was horrendous, sloppy, and just didn't have anything to tie it together. And it was then that the subplot of Carl and the golf course destroying gopher, it was that brought it all together. Spliced in between scenes of the actual script were all these extra scenes involving Carl's plan to end the gopher's reign of destruction. And now, Billy and that gopher are what people remember most when they think of Caddyshack. In both the Burbs and Caddyshack, all the dudes' destructive paranoia are what caused both movies to come to such explosive endings. Such needless, exaggerated, monumentally explosive endings where all the men involved end up feeling kind of like dummies. I could talk more on Carl Spackler, and I'm sure I will in a future Murray moment, but those times have to be saved for those moments. Ad-libbing and destructive paranoid dudes are the themes for this week's Murray moment, because had Carl been the groundskeeper in that subdivision in the Burbs, he would have been front and center with those guys in all the action.
You always got to call me out on my Caddyshack.
Yeah, I do.
I don't mind it. I don't hate the movie.
You don't hate it?
I don't hate it. It just doesn't do for me what it does for most of its fans.
I mean, I think, well, yeah, for most of its fans, but I don't think that you're alone in, it not being.
Jeez.
I just gotta. I mean. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to call you out, Justin.
Jeez, I don't call you out on all the movies you told me that you secretly hate.
Jeez, you can totally call me out on anything that I say that I just called myself out on hating Tom Hanks.
It's all right.
But I'm over it. Maybe you'll get over your hatred of
Caddyshack.
Caddyshack
Thank you for that
one
Murray
day.
moment. Speaking of actors ad-libbing, my favorite ad-lib that I read from the Burbs is Tom Hanks throwing himself on the gurney at the end of the movie.
Mine too.
And putting himself into the ambulance and saying, "Take me to the hospital, I'm sick."
It's such a funny moment. He really just does throw his whole body into the back of that ambulance.
He's really good at physical comedy and improv.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that Murray moment.
Of course.
Well, let's, is there any, I know you had a special little wrap up here for the Burbs that I'm actually excited to hear about. I know this is it's been something of an obsession with you as well, and a fascination over several movies that we've watched throughout the year or so.
I'm so glad to finally bring it up because I feel like this is an actor that never got her due. And she was in so many iconic movies.
From Silence of the Lambs to
Burbs to Coming to America to Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Batman Returns. Okay.
Crazy.
Multiple episodes of Coach. Also the Joe Dante series we mentioned earlier, Erie, Indiana. She was in that. And the one that is yet unconfirmed, but I'm fairly solid. It was in her wheelhouse and during the time of her reign as queen of canine Hollywood actors. Darla the dog, you might know from the Burbs. She's Queenie. She has she has a lot of scenes in this movie, a few dramatic close-ups.
And is Precious in Silence of the Lambs, the dog that's in the well, or the dog that's the pet of the serial killer Buffalo Bill. And
yeah, she's Precious. Don't make me hurt your dog. Yes. And I think maybe her, man, I don't even know what my favorite performance of hers is. Like in Batman Returns, she's delivering a grenade. I mean, this dog she's got talent. In Coming to America, there are multiple close-ups and one climactic scene. She's facilitating this supremely well done and comedically edited scene at the end with these close-ups. But I think my favorite performance by Darla was in Chud 2, Bud the Chud, where she does get turned into a chud. And this is kind of where, well, there are a lot of things that fall apart in that movie. But since I was a youngster, there's just one scene that really sticks with me. And it was Darla's stunt double, which was a obviously stuffed animal dog that was being thrown very obviously at a mailman that you see in the background. But Darla's performance in the rest of that movie as a feral chud-like dog, man, I mean, I don't know how you can go from comedy to horror to drama. What she got out of in her performance in Silence of the Lambs, I mean,
maybe one of the most famous and long-ranging canine actors in film history. Yeah. I'm glad that you brought this to light, though.
She retired in Thousand Oaks, California, shortly after her performance in Batman Returns, and passed away shortly after that. A long life, I think around 18, I think.
Wow.
Yeah, she was a Bichon. And just as a little side note, her trainer said that one of her favorite things was to steal socks.
Wow.
So, Darla the dog, please, the next time you're watching The Burbs or any of these movies that we mentioned, please take into account her performance.
Yeah.
That she was a solidly trained dog actor. And man, I really hope she cranked in some treats over all these performances.
I know when we did The Burbs, I had a feeling this was going to come light because you've talked about Darla many times.
I have. It's been a quest to find out Darla's
the lineage,
how she started, some unconfirmed roles. Was this her? I'm not sure, because that's the thing. Darla was a shapeshifter. She could look like a poodle. She could look like a Bichon.
Quite a few dogs in The Burbs, and
it's true.
I think that's a very suburban thing. Everybody's got a dog.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even the evil Klopex.
And even trained to take a crap on someone's lawn. I mean, You can't even tell a person to do that.
Yeah. So we hope you've enjoyed our episode on The Burbs. I love this movie. It's always so much fun. I'm glad, you were down to do this one.
I love your love for The Burbs, and I also think it was a perfect kickoff to the month of October.
Yes. As we've always said, October is our favorite month. Halloween is our favorite holiday. And we did this last year. I'm glad we're continuing this tradition. We're going to do an extra episode. We're going to do all horror movies for the month of October. We're kicking things off with Candyman, a real great 90s horror film that I think is definitely underseen. We're going to follow that up with the 1988 remake of The Blob.
One of my faves.
Yeah. And then you get a bonus episode the week of Halloween. We're going to be doing what we've called 80s versus 90s slashers. We're going to try to cram in 20 years, 2 decades worth of slashers movies, and hopefully not an incredibly long episode.
It's our special 72-hour podcast.
It's going to get pretty crazy. We've got our work cut out for us. We've got a lot of slasher movies to start watching. So that's coming up for you in October. If you haven't been following us on social media, please do. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Don't Push Pause Podcast. If you'd like to check out older episodes that aren't available on your podcast platforms, you can go to our archives at don'tpushpausepodcast.com. Find them all there, all the old episodes. If you like what you hear, if you're on iTunes, please give us a rating, 5-star rating if you could. If you stream and don't download, please download the episodes if you can. It helps us track our growth and see how many people are listening. Lindsay, you've also been working on our store and on our website.
Yeah, we've got a couple things with our Don't Push Pause logo on it, as well as some, you might be, if you follow us on Instagram, you might be familiar with our handmade VHS boxes that we have for sale, hand stained boxes that we have dismantled original VHS boxes and affixed them to the boxes and inside of the original VHS
They're
tapes.
pretty fun, sweet little keepsake or storage boxes.
Keepsake, make great presents.
There's pictures of them on our store. You can check them out, and as well as other merch with the Don't
Coffee
Push
cup,
Pause logo
koozie,
on it. Yeah,
pin. You need it? We got it.
Yeah, so check it out. Maybe there's something you might like. And all money from that goes to help keeping the podcast going and helps us fund the things we need to do to keep this thing running and give you guys a great and professional show. So until next time, I'm Justin Johnson.
And I'm Lindsay Reber.
Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you.